Clean out the barn and sell the property for whatever you can get. Those were my brother's final words to me. I thought I was just inheriting a pile of rotting wood and bad memories. But what I discovered hidden beneath those floorboards changed everything and left my entire family stunned. I'm so glad to have you here with me today. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this incredible journey has reached. I never thought that at 70 years old, my quiet retirement would be turned completely upside down by a crumbling barn in rural Vermont. My name is Rosalind Thorne, and if you had told me 3 months ago that I'd be standing in a lawyer's office inheriting property from the brother who hadn't spoken to me in 18 years, I would have laughed. Not a happy laugh, mind you, but the bitter kind that comes from a lifetime of disappointment. At 70, I had settled into what I thought would be my final chapter. My small apartment in Maplewood Heights overlooked the town's only grocery store and the post office where I collected my Social Security checks every month. The wallpaper was faded yellow roses that had been there when I moved in, and I'd never bothered changing it. Why spend money on decorating when you're just waiting for life to wind down? My daily routine was as predictable as sunrise. Coffee at 6 a.m. while watching the morning news, a walk to the corner market for whatever I could afford, afternoons spent reading library books or working on crossword puzzles that kept my mind sharp, evenings alone with a TV dinner and whatever program could distract me from the silence. It wasn't much of a life, but it was peaceful, and at my age, peace felt more valuable than excitement. My 3 children lived scattered across the country, busy with their own families and careers. Sarah was a nurse in Oregon, barely managing to call once a month. Michael had become a lawyer in Texas, too important now to remember his mother's birthday. And Jennifer, my youngest, was somewhere in Florida working for a tech company I couldn't pronounce. They were good kids, but they'd moved on, built their own lives, and I understood that. I'd raised them to be independent, and independence meant they didn't need their old mother hovering around. The loneliness was bearable most days. It was the financial stress that kept me awake at nights, calculating and recalculating whether my $1,247 monthly Social Security check would stretch to cover rent, utilities, medications, and food. Every month was a careful balancing act, and every unexpected expense, a higher electric bill, a prescription increase, a car repair, threatened to topple the whole precarious structure of my existence. That's why Nathaniel's call came as such a shock. Nathaniel Greenberg had been my brother's lawyer for as long as I can remember, though I'd only met him once at our parents' funeral back in 2006. He was a small, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of methodical speech pattern that made every conversation feel like a legal deposition. "Mrs. Thorne," he said when I answered the phone that gray Tuesday morning in April, "I'm calling regarding your brother Roderick Ashworth's estate. I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share." Roderick! Even hearing his name spoken aloud felt strange after so many years of silence. My older brother, the golden child, who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes, who'd built a construction empire while I struggled to make ends meet as a single mother after my husband died young. Roderick, who'd inherited our family 200-acre farm when our parents passed, and had spent the last 18 years making it clear that I wasn't welcome there. "What about Roderick?" I asked, though something in Mr. Greenberg's tone already told me the answer. "He suffered a massive heart attack last Thursday morning. He was found in his office by his secretary. I'm very sorry for your loss, Mrs. Thorne." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, staring at the cracked linoleum floor. Roderick was dead. At 74, he'd been only 4 years older than me, but he'd always seemed invincible. Even as children, he'd been the stronger one, the smarter one, the one who never got sick or scared or uncertain about anything. The idea that his heart could simply stop working seemed impossible. "Mrs. Thorne, are you still there?" "Yes," I managed. "I'm here. When is the funeral?" "The service was yesterday morning. I apologize for not contacting you sooner, but your brother left very specific instructions about his funeral arrangements. He wanted only a small, private ceremony. Only a small, private ceremony, which meant I hadn't been invited to my own brother's funeral. Even in death, Roderick was still punishing me for that terrible fight we had after our parents' burial, when I had accused him of caring more about property values than family bonds. However, Mr. Greenberg continued, there is a matter regarding his estate that requires your immediate attention. Your brother has left you a specific bequest. Could you come to my office this week to discuss the details? I almost laughed. Roderick leaving me something? After 18 years of treating me like I didn't exist? After refusing to take my calls when I was struggling to pay for my husband's cancer treatments? After making it clear that the family farm where we'd both grown up was his domain and his alone? What kind of bequest? I asked suspiciously. I'd prefer to discuss the details in person, Mrs. Thorne. The matter is somewhat complex, and there are documents you'll need to review and sign. Would Friday afternoon be convenient? I agreed to the meeting, though I spent the rest of the week convinced this was some kind of cruel joke. Maybe Roderick had left me $1 just to make a point about how little I meant to him. Maybe it was a bill for something I was supposed to pay. Nothing about this felt real or hopeful. Mr. Greenberg's office was in downtown Millbrook, the county seat, in one of those old brick buildings that made you feel like you were stepping back in time. His secretary, a woman about my age with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, offered me coffee and asked about the weather while I waited. I declined the coffee. My stomach was too nervous to handle caffeine, and tried to focus on breathing steadily. When Mr. Greenberg finally called me into his office, I was surprised by how warm and personal the space felt. Family photos on his desk, children's artwork hung on the walls, books that looked actually read rather than just displayed for show. He gestured for me to sit in a comfortable leather chair across from his desk. Mrs. Thorne, first let me say again how sorry I am for your loss. I know you and your brother had been estranged, but losing family is never easy, regardless of the circumstances. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The truth was, I didn't know how I felt about Roderick's death. Sad, certainly, but also angry and confused, and strangely relieved that the possibility of reconciliation, a possibility I'd never quite given up on, was finally, definitively, over. Your brother left very detailed instructions regarding his estate, Mr. Greenberg continued, opening a thick file folder. The majority of his assets, his construction company, his primary residence, his investment properties, go to the Ashworth Foundation, a charitable organization he established several years ago to provide scholarships for underprivileged children. That sounded like Roderick. Even in death, he'd found a way to be the generous benefactor, the pillar of the community. I wondered if anyone would know that he'd let his own sister struggle financially while he built his charitable legacy. However, Mr. Greenberg said, pulling out a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Roderick's familiar handwriting, he left specific instructions regarding the original family property, the 160 acres where you both grew up, including the old dairy barn. That property is being transferred to you, along with this letter he wanted you to receive personally. I stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. The family farm? The place where we'd spent our childhood, where our parents had lived and died, where Roderick had built his new house after inheriting everything? He was giving it to me? I don't understand, I said quietly. Why would he leave me the farm? We haven't spoken in almost 20 years. I can't speak to your brother's motivations, Mrs. Thorne. I can only execute his wishes as outlined in his will. The transfer is unconditional and immediate, though there are some details we'll need to discuss regarding taxes and ownership responsibilities. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope.
Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper with a message written in Roderick's aggressive, slanted handwriting. Rosalind, I suppose by now you're wondering why I'd leave you the old place after all these years of silence. The truth is, I never stopped thinking about our fight after Mom and Dad's funeral. You said I cared more about land than family, and maybe you were right. I built my house on that property, but I could never bring myself to tear down the old barn where we used to play as children. There's something in there I've been meaning to deal with for years, but I ran out of time. The barn is falling apart and probably isn't safe, but before you tear it down or sell the land, I need you to go inside and look around. There are loose floorboards in the northwest corner. You'll know them when you see them. What's underneath belongs to you more than it ever belonged to me. I'm sorry we couldn't figure out how to be brother and sister again before it was too late. The house and 5 acres around it go to the foundation, but the rest of the land and the barn are yours. Do whatever you think is right. Roderick. I read the letter 3 times before looking up at Mr. Greenberg. He wants me to go into the barn and look under some floorboards? It appears so. Mrs. Thorne, I should mention that the property is quite valuable. The 155 acres you're inheriting, even with the restrictions on the house and immediate grounds, has an estimated market value of approximately $400,000. That's based on recent comparable sales in the area. $400,000? I felt dizzy. That was more money than I'd ever imagined having, more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life without worrying about choosing between medications and groceries. However, Mr. Greenberg said, there are annual property taxes of about $8,000, and as your brother mentioned, the barn structure is in significant disrepair. You'll need to decide whether to invest in restoration, demolition, or simply sell the entire property. We spent the next hour going over paperwork, transfer documents, and legal responsibilities. Mr. Greenberg explained that I was now the official owner of 155 acres of prime Vermont farmland, including a 19th century dairy barn that was apparently large enough to house 50 cattle in its heyday. The property had been in our family for 4 generations, originally purchased by our great-grandfather in 1897.
As I drove home that afternoon, my mind was reeling. After a lifetime of financial struggle, I was suddenly a landowner, a person of property. But more than that, I was haunted by Roderick's letter. What could possibly be hidden under the floorboards of an old barn? And why had he waited until after his death to tell me about it? I called my daughter Jennifer that evening, needing to tell someone about this incredible turn of events. "Mom, that's amazing," she said when I explained about the inheritance. $400,000? You could travel or move to a nice retirement community or... Wait, what do you mean there's something hidden in the barn? I don't know what it means, honey. Your uncle's letter was cryptic. He said there are loose floorboards I need to look under. Mom, please tell me you're not planning to go poking around in some dangerous old barn by yourself. Those old barns can collapse without warning. Jennifer was right to be concerned. At 70, I wasn't exactly equipped for exploring potentially unstable structures. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Roderick's final message was important, that whatever he'd hidden in that barn was the real reason he'd left me the property. I'll be careful, I promised her. Maybe I'll ask the fire department to check it out first, make sure it's safe. Better yet, hire a contractor to assess the building before you go inside. Mom, I'm serious about this. I don't want you getting hurt trying to solve some mystery from Uncle Roderick's past. After we hung up, I sat in my small living room, staring at the letter and trying to decode my brother's intentions. Roderick had never been sentimental or mysterious. He was practical, direct, sometimes brutally honest. If he'd gone to the trouble of hiding something in that barn and then directing me to find it, it had to be significant. I spent the weekend researching the property online, looking at satellite images and old real estate listings. The family farm sat on Willowbrook Road, about 15 miles outside of Millbrook, in an area that had once been entirely agricultural, but was now increasingly popular with people looking to build country homes.
The barn itself was visible in the satellite photos, a massive red structure that dwarfed the newer house Roderick had built nearby. Monday morning, I called a local contractor named Pete Morrison, who'd been recommended by Mr. Greenberg. Pete was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who specialized in historic building restoration. "Mrs. Thorne, I knew your brother fairly well," he said when I explained what I needed. "Roderick hired me a few times over the years for work on his house. I always wondered why he never did anything with that old barn. It's a beautiful structure, architecturally speaking, but it's been neglected for decades." "Is it safe to go inside?" "I'd need to do a full inspection to give you a definitive answer, but I drove past it a few months ago and the structure looked stable enough. The roof is in bad shape and there's probably water damage throughout, but the main support beams appeared solid. When would you like me to take a look?" We arranged to meet at the property Wednesday morning. Pete would do a safety assessment, and if the barn was structurally sound enough to enter, I'd finally solve the mystery of what my brother had hidden beneath those floorboards. Tuesday night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Roderick as a child, the way he used to challenge me to explore every corner of that barn, climbing up to the hayloft, hiding in empty stalls, pretending we were pirates or explorers or whatever adventure captured our imagination that day. The barn had been our castle, our fortress, our secret kingdom where we ruled together before the adult world taught us to compete instead of collaborate. What could he have hidden there that belonged to me more than it ever belonged to him? Wednesday morning dawned clear and cold, with that crisp April air that promised spring was finally winning its battle against winter. I dressed warmly and drove out to Willowbrook Road, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The family farm looked smaller than I remembered, though that might have been because the surrounding area had been developed with new houses over the years. Roderick's modern colonial house sat on a hill overlooking the road with its manicured lawn and professional landscaping. It looked expensive and soulless, nothing like the rambling farmhouse where we had grown up. But the barn was exactly as I remembered it, only sadder. The red paint had faded to rusty brown, and several of the roof tiles had come loose or fallen off entirely. Ivy covered most of the eastern wall, and the large front doors hung at odd angles that suggested the hinges were failing. Still, there was something majestic about the structure, something that spoke to its history as the centerpiece of a working farm. Pete Morrison arrived right on time, driving a pickup truck loaded with safety equipment and inspection tools. He was a tall, lean man with calloused hands and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades working outdoors. "Morning, Mrs. Thorne," he said, pulling on a hard hat and safety vest. "Ready to see what your brother left you?" We spent the next hour walking around the exterior of the barn while Pete examined the foundation, support posts, and roof structure. He took photos, made notes on a clipboard, and occasionally tested the stability of various boards and beams.
"Well, the good news is that the main structure is sound," he said finally. "The foundation is solid stone, and the primary support beams are in better condition than I expected. The roof needs work, and there's definitely water damage in places, but it's not going to collapse on us if we go inside." "And the bad news?" "This building is going to need significant investment if you want to restore it. We're talking about $150,000 to $200,000 to bring it back to proper condition. That's assuming we don't find any major surprises once we start opening things up." Pete unlocked the main doors with a key Mr. Greenberg had provided, and we stepped inside together. The interior was darker than I'd expected, with only thin streams of sunlight filtering through gaps in the walls and roof. The smell was overwhelming at first. Decades of dust, hay, old wood, and something else I couldn't identify. Something sweet and musty that seemed oddly familiar. "Watch your step," Pete warned, shining a powerful flashlight around the space. "Some of these floorboards are rotted through." As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I could see that the barn was larger than I'd remembered. The main floor was open and cavernous, with a soaring ceiling supported by massive wooden beams. A ladder led up to what had once been the hayloft, though I couldn't see much of that level from where we stood.
Scattered around the floor were remnants of the barn's agricultural past, old milk stanchions, rusted farm tools, pieces of machinery I couldn't identify. But it wasn't the equipment that caught my attention. In the far corner, exactly where Roderick had described, I could see an area where the floorboards looked different, newer, out of place. "Pete," I said, pointing toward the corner, "can you check those boards over there? They look like they might be loose." He followed my gaze and walked over to investigate, testing the stability of the floor with each step. When he reached the area I'd indicated, he knelt down and examined the boards more closely. "You're right," he said, looking back at me with raised eyebrows. "These boards are definitely newer than the rest of the floor, and they're not properly secured. It looks like someone created a kind of access panel here." My heart started beating faster. "Can you lift them up?" Pete retrieved a pry bar from his toolkit and carefully worked at the edge of the loose section. With a creaking sound that echoed through the barn, a section of floorboards about 4 feet square lifted away, revealing a dark space beneath. "Mrs. Thorne," Pete said, his voice tight with surprise, "you need to see this." I walked over on unsteady legs and peered down into the opening Pete had created. His flashlight beam illuminated what appeared to be a wooden crate, roughly the size of a coffin, sitting in a shallow depression that had been carved out of the earth beneath the barn's floor. "What is it?" I whispered, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "I don't know," Pete said, "but whatever it is, someone went to a lot of trouble to hide it." The wooden crate sat in the shallow depression like a secret waiting to be told. Pete's flashlight beam danced across its surface, revealing hand-carved details and metal hinges that had somehow survived decades of New England winters despite being buried beneath the barn floor. "Mrs. Thorne," Pete said carefully, "before we do anything else, I think we should call someone. The police, maybe? Or—" "No," I said quickly, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "Not yet. This is what Roderick wanted me to find. Let's see what it is first." Pete looked uncertain, but he nodded. "All right, but we're going to document everything. I'm taking photos of the scene before we disturb anything." He pulled out his phone and began taking pictures from multiple angles, the camera flash illuminating the hidden chamber in stark detail. The crate was approximately 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, and maybe 18 inches deep. It appeared to be made of solid oak with brass corner reinforcements and a heavy-duty latch that had been secured with what looked like a modern padlock. Someone had taken great care to hide whatever was inside from moisture and time. "Can you help me lift it out?" I asked, though my 70-year-old back was already protesting the idea. "Let's see how heavy it is first," Pete said, climbing down into the depression. He tested the weight by lifting one corner. "It's substantial, but not impossibly heavy. Maybe 60 or 70 pounds? We can manage it together, but we should bring it up to the main floor where there's better light." Working together, we carefully lifted the crate out of its hiding place and set it on the barn floor. In the dim light filtering through the walls, I could see that the wood was beautifully crafted, with dovetail joints and a level of craftsmanship that spoke of either professional woodworking or someone with exceptional skill. "The padlock is newer than the crate," Pete observed, examining the latch mechanism. "Someone added security relatively recently, maybe within the last 20 years. My hands were trembling as I reached into my purse for the keys Mr. Greenberg had given me. Among the various barn and property keys was a small brass key that I'd assumed was for a storage shed or toolbox. Now, looking at it more closely, I realized it might fit the padlock on the crate. The key slid into the lock perfectly. "Before you open it," Pete said gently, "are you sure you want to do this? Your brother went to a lot of trouble to hide whatever's in there. It might be something you're not prepared to see." I thought about Roderick's letter, about his words that what was inside belonged to me more than it ever belonged to him. Whatever secrets this crate held, they were part of my family's history, part of the story that had shaped our lives, even if I didn't understand how. I need to know, I said, and turned the key. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the cavernous barn. I lifted the heavy lid, my heart hammering against my ribs, and peered inside. What I saw took my breath away. The crate was filled with carefully wrapped objects, each item protected by what appeared to be archival tissue paper and sealed plastic bags. But even through the protective wrapping, I could see the gleam of metal, the rich colors of painted ceramics, and the unmistakable patina of age. "My God," Pete whispered, leaning over my shoulder. "Mrs. Thorne, I think these might be antiques, valuable ones." With reverent care, I lifted out the first item, a silver serving tray wrapped in tissue paper. When I unwrapped it, the metal cut the light and threw it back in brilliant flashes. The tray was ornate, with intricate engravings around the border and what appeared to be a family crest in the center. It was heavy, substantial, and clearly very old. "Look at the markings on the bottom," Pete said, turning the tray over. There, stamped into the silver, were hallmarks that indicated both the purity of the metal and its origin. "This is English sterling silver, and from the style of the hallmarks, I'd guess it's from the late 1800s or early 1900s. I set the tray aside and reached for the next item, a delicate porcelain figurine of a dancing woman in an elaborate ball gown. The detail was extraordinary, from the tiny flowers painted on her dress to the expression of joy on her face. When I turned it over, I found a maker's mark that read, "Royal Doulton," along with what appeared to be a date code. "Royal Doulton," Pete said, recognizing the name. "That's high-end English porcelain. If this is authentic and in good condition, it could be worth several $1,000s just by itself." One by one, we carefully removed items from the crate. A set of 6 crystal wine glasses, each one perfect and gleaming. A jewelry box made of what appeared to be mahogany and mother-of-pearl inlay. A collection of gold pocket watches, their faces still keeping time despite their age. A tea service made of fine bone china with hand-painted roses. Books bound in leather with gold lettering on their spines. But it was the photograph album that made me sink to my knees on the barn floor. The album was bound in rich burgundy leather with brass corners, and when I opened it, I found myself looking at pictures I'd never seen before. Family photographs dating back to what appeared to be the 1920s and 1930s. Wedding pictures, holiday celebrations, children playing in elaborate gardens. Their clothing and surroundings suggested wealth and privilege that I'd never associated with our family history. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a photograph of an elegant Victorian house with wraparound porches and elaborate trim work. "This house, it's beautiful, but I've never seen it before." Pete studied the photograph over my shoulder. "That's not just any house, Mrs. Thorne. Look at the architectural details, the landscaping, the sheer size of it. That's a mansion. Your family lived in a mansion." I continued turning pages, and the evidence became overwhelming. Our ancestors hadn't been simple farmers struggling to make ends meet. They'd been wealthy, possibly very wealthy, with servants and fine carriages and social connections that spanned multiple generations. But if that was true, what had happened to all of this wealth? Why had Roderick and I grown up in modest circumstances on a working dairy farm? Why had our parents never mentioned this earlier prosperity? At the back of the album, tucked into a small pocket, I found a folded document that appeared to be very old. When I carefully unfolded it, I realized I was looking at a property deed dated 1923. The document transferred ownership of something called Ashworth Manor and its associated holdings from one Edmund Ashworth to his son Harold Ashworth. Harold Ashworth? That was our grandfather's name. Pete was examining one of the pocket watches, squinting at tiny markings on the inside of the case. "Mrs. Thorne, this watch has an inscription. It says, 'To Harold, on the occasion of your graduation from Harvard University, with love and pride, Father. June 22, 1922. Harvard University. Our grandfather had graduated from Harvard in 1922, and someone had given him an expensive gold watch to commemorate the achievement. This wasn't the story of our family that I'd grown up with. Our grandfather had been described to us as a hardworking farmer who'd immigrated from Ireland with nothing but determination and a willingness to work long hours. I spent the next hour cataloging everything in the crate while Pete took detailed photographs. In total, we found
12 pieces of sterling silver servingware, a complete set of Royal Dalton china for 12 people, 6 crystal decanters and matching glass sets, a collection of 15 antique pocket watches and jewelry pieces, 7 leather-bound first edition books, including works by Charles Dickens and Mark Twain, the photograph album with over 100 family pictures, multiple legal documents, including property deeds and stock certificates, a collection of military medals and commendations from World War I. But the most shocking discovery came at the very bottom of the crate. Wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed in multiple plastic bags was a manila envelope containing bank documents from 1954. The papers indicated that Harold Ashworth, our grandfather, had maintained accounts at 3 different banks in Boston, with combined assets totaling over $800,000. In 1954, that represented enormous wealth. "Pete," I said, staring at the bank statements, "according to these documents, our grandfather was wealthy into the 1950s, but Roderick and I were born in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and we grew up poor. What happened to all this money?" Pete was examining the stock certificates, his expression growing more serious by the minute. "Mrs. Thorne, some of these companies still exist. If these certificates were never sold or transferred, they could still have value, potentially significant value." I felt dizzy. Nothing about this discovery made sense in the context of the family history I'd been told. Our parents had raised us to believe that we came from humble farming stock, that every dollar had to be earned through hard work and sacrifice. They'd never mentioned mansion houses or Harvard educations or substantial bank accounts. Why had they hidden this from us? And more importantly, what had happened to the family wealth between 1954 and our childhood? "I need to call Mr. Greenberg," I said, struggling to my feet. "There's something wrong here. Something doesn't add up." Pete helped me carefully repack everything back into the crate, though we kept the photograph album and the bank documents separate. "Mrs. Thorne, if even half of these items are authentic and in good condition, you're looking at a collection worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more." As we secured the barn and prepared to leave, my mind was racing with questions. Had Roderick known about all of this? Is that why he directed me to the hidden crate? But if he'd known our family had been wealthy, why hadn't he ever mentioned it during our childhood or even during our adult years before our estrangement? And why hide these treasures in a barn instead of properly preserving them or displaying them in his house? The drive back to my apartment felt surreal. I kept glancing at the photograph album on my passenger seat, as if it might disappear if I didn't keep checking on it. The images of that grand house, those elegant people in expensive clothing, the evidence of a family prosperity I'd never suspected, it all felt like someone else's history accidentally mixed up with mine. That evening, I called Mr. Greenberg's office and left an urgent message asking for a meeting the next day. Then I spread the bank documents across my kitchen table and tried to make sense of the timeline. According to the papers, Harold Ashworth had been making substantial deposits and investments throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. The account statements showed a man who understood money, who was actively managing a diverse portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate investments. But I remembered my grandfather dying when I was 7 years old, in 1957. By then, our family was already struggling financially. My father had been working long hours trying to keep the dairy farm profitable, and my mother had taken a part-time job at the local general store to help make ends meet. What had happened to our grandfather's wealth in those final years of his life? I called my daughter Jennifer that night, needing to share this incredible discovery with someone. "Mom, this is unbelievable," she said when I described what we found. "You're telling me that great-grandfather Harold was wealthy and nobody ever mentioned it?" "Not just wealthy, honey.
These bank statements suggest he was very wealthy, and there are photographs of him and your great-grandmother living in what looks like a mansion. Have you tried Googling the family name? Maybe there are historical records or newspaper articles that mention the Ashworths. After we hung up, I spent 2 hours at my computer searching for any information about the Ashworth family in New England. What I found made the mystery even deeper. Edmund Ashworth, Harold's father, and my great-grandfather, had apparently been a prominent businessman in Boston during the early 1900s. There were newspaper articles mentioning his involvement in textile manufacturing and real estate development. Several society page mentions of parties and charitable events hosted at the Ashworth estate in Brookline. Harold Ashworth appeared in several newspaper articles as well, primarily related to his service in World War I, and later his involvement in various business ventures. There was even a wedding announcement from 1925 describing his marriage to Miss Margaret Elizabeth Tarnfield, daughter of the prominent Tarnfield banking family. Margaret Tarnfield. That had been our grandmother's maiden name, though I'd never heard anything about her family being prominent in banking. But the newspaper trail went cold abruptly in 1952. After that date, I couldn't find any mention of Harold Ashworth or the family businesses. It was as if they'd simply vanished from public life.
Friday morning, I met with Mr. Greenberg and showed him everything we'd discovered. His reaction was immediate and intense. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, studying the bank documents with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. "These papers suggest that your grandfather had substantial assets that should have been part of his estate when he died. Do you have any knowledge of what happened during the settlement of his will?" "I was only 7 when he died," I said. "I remember the funeral, but I don't remember anything about legal proceedings or estate matters." Mr. Greenberg was making notes on a legal pad, his expression growing more concerned as he examined each document. "These stock certificates, if they're legitimate, represent ownership stakes in companies that were worth considerable money in the 1950s. Some of these corporations still exist today in different forms. If the stocks were never properly transferred or sold, they could still belong to your grandfather's estate. What does that mean for me?" "It means we need to do some serious investigation. If your grandfather died with substantial assets that were never properly distributed according to his will, and if those assets should have passed to your father, and then to you and your brother, we could be looking at a significant inheritance that was somehow lost or misdirected." Mr. Greenberg promised to begin researching the matter immediately. He would check probate records from 1957, try to locate Harold Ashworth's original will, and investigate what had happened to the various business interests and financial accounts. "Mrs. Thorne," he said as our meeting concluded, "I want you to understand that this could be a complex and time-consuming process. Estate law from the 1950s was different from today, and records from that era are sometimes incomplete or difficult to locate. But if what these documents suggest is true, someone needs to be held accountable for what appears to be a significant misappropriation of your family's assets." As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that Roderick had known more about the situation than his letter had indicated. Why else would he have gone to such elaborate lengths to hide these family treasures and documents? And why wait until after his death to reveal them to me? That afternoon, I decided to drive back to the family farm and take another look at Roderick's house. As the new owner of the property, I had the right to walk around the grounds, and I was curious to see if there were other clues he might have left behind. The house was a modern colonial, built in the 1980s, according to county records. It was well-maintained and expensively furnished, but it felt sterile, like a model home, rather than a place where someone had actually lived. There were no family photographs on display, no personal mementos or sentimental objects that would give insight into Roderick's personality or interests. But
in his home office, I found something that made my blood run cold. On his desk, in a folder marked Family History Research, were photocopies of many of the same documents I'd found in the barn crate. Bank statements, stock certificates, property deeds, all relating to our grandfather Harold's estate. But there were also newer documents, legal papers from the 1990s and 2000s, that suggested Roderick had been investigating the disappearance of our family's wealth for years. At the bottom of the folder was a handwritten note in Roderick's familiar script. Mother knew. She had to have known. The question is whether father was complicit or just weak. Either way, they stole our inheritance and spent 30 years lying to us about who we really were. R.A., March 2019. Our mother knew. According to Roderick's research, our parents had known about the family wealth and had somehow been involved in its disappearance. They hadn't been innocent victims of circumstance. They'd been participants in covering up what should have been our inheritance. I sat in Roderick's office chair, surrounded by evidence of a betrayal that spanned generations, and finally understood why my brother had never been able to forgive or forget our family past. He discovered that everything we'd been told about our family history was a lie. And now, 18 years after our estrangement and a week after his death, he'd passed that burden of knowledge on to me. The morning after discovering Roderick's research folder, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. At 70, I'd thought my days of fighting for anything were behind me, but the evidence of my family's stolen inheritance had ignited something fierce inside me. I wasn't just going to let this go. I owed it to myself, to Roderick's memory, and to the generations of Ashworths who had worked to build that wealth to find out exactly what had happened. I called Mr. Greenberg first thing Monday morning and arranged to bring Roderick's research files. When I arrived at his office, his secretary immediately ushered me in, and I could see from his expression that he'd already begun his own investigation. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, gesturing for me to sit down, "I've spent the weekend going through probate records from 1957, and what I found is deeply troubling." He opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across his desk. "Your grandfather, Harold Ashworth, did indeed die with substantial assets, just as those bank statements indicate. According to the probate court filings, his estate was valued at $847,000 in 1957 dollars. I felt my breath catch. In today's money, that would be worth millions.
However, Mr. Greenberg continued, his voice taking on the careful tone lawyers use when delivering bad news, the estate settlement shows that virtually all of those assets were used to pay what were described as outstanding debts and business obligations. According to the court documents, your grandfather had apparently guaranteed several business loans that went into default shortly before his death. Business loans? I asked. What kind of business loans? That's where this gets interesting. The debts were supposedly owed to something called Thornfield Holdings Corporation. The name should sound familiar. That was your grandmother's maiden name. I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. You're saying that grandmother's family business claimed my grandfather owed them money? Not just claimed, they provided documentation to the probate court showing promissory notes, loan agreements, and business partnership contracts that indicated Harold Ashworth owed Thornfield Holdings the entire value of his estate. Mr. Greenberg pulled out a copy of an old court document. Here's the problem, Mrs. Thorne. I've been researching Thornfield Holdings, and there's no evidence that this company ever existed outside of these probate proceedings. No business licenses, no tax filings, no corporate records with the state. It appears to have been created specifically to strip assets from your grandfather's estate. The room felt like it was spinning. Are you saying this was fraud? I'm saying it appears that way, yes, but
Proving fraud that occurred over 65 years ago, when most of the principals are deceased, presents significant challenges. I showed him Roderick's research folder, including his handwritten note about our mother's knowledge of the situation. Mr. Greenberg studied each document carefully, occasionally making notes or cross-referencing items with his own research. "Your brother was quite thorough," he said finally. "Some of these documents I haven't been able to locate in my own research. He must have spent years putting this together." "Mr. Greenberg, if what you're suggesting is true, then my parents stole our inheritance. They let Roderick and me grow up poor while they knew there should have been family wealth." "It's more complicated than that, Mrs. Thorne. Based on what I'm seeing here, it appears that your grandmother, Margaret, orchestrated the fraud, possibly with help from other members of the Thornfield family. Your father may have been an unwitting beneficiary, or he may have been complicit. Without additional evidence, it's difficult to determine his level of involvement." Mr. Greenberg leaned back in his chair, studying my face carefully. "There's something else you need to know. If we can prove that the estate settlement was fraudulent, you and your brother's heirs might have a claim against the assets that were wrongfully taken. Even after all these years, the law provides remedies for estate fraud." "What kind of remedies?" "Recovery of assets, plus interest and damages. Mrs. Thorne, if your grandfather's estate was worth $847,000 in 1957, and that money was invested even conservatively over the past 65 years, we could be talking about a claim worth several million dollars." Several million dollars. I felt dizzy thinking about it. After a lifetime of financial struggle, the possibility of recovering what should have been my family's inheritance seemed almost too incredible to believe. "What do we need to do?" I asked. "We need more evidence. Your brother's research is helpful, but we need documentation that proves the Thornfield Holdings loans were fraudulent. We need to trace what happened to the money after it was supposedly paid to settle those debts, and we need to find out if any members of the Thornfield family are still alive." Over the next 2 weeks, Mr. Greenberg and I embarked on an investigation that felt like something out of a detective novel. We visited county courthouses, searched through old business records, and contacted genealogy researchers who specialized in tracking down family histories. What we discovered was a pattern of financial manipulation that spanned decades. Margaret Thornfield Ashworth, my grandmother, had apparently been the mastermind behind an elaborate scheme to transfer her husband's wealth to her own family. Working with her brothers Edward and Charles Thornfield, she had created fake business entities, forged loan documents, and manipulated the probate process to make it appear that Harold's entire estate was needed to satisfy debts. The Thornfield brothers had then used the stolen money to purchase real estate throughout New England, building a property empire that still existed today under the name Thornfield Development Corporation. "Mrs. Thorne," Mr. Greenberg said during one of our weekly meetings, "I've located the current owners of Thornfield Development. Margaret's nephew, Robert Thornfield, is now the CEO. The company owns shopping centers, office buildings, and residential developments worth approximately $40 million. $40 million built on money stolen from my grandfather's estate." "There's more," he continued. "I found evidence that your parents received payments from Thornfield Development for years after your grandfather's death. Small amounts, described as family support in the company records, but payments nonetheless. He showed me copies of canceled checks dating from 1958 through 1987, monthly payments of $200 to $500 made out to James and Dorothy Ashworth, my parents. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough to explain how they'd managed to keep the dairy farm running during years when other small farms in the area were failing." "So they were being paid to keep quiet," I said, the pieces finally falling into place.
It appears so. Your parents received just enough money to maintain a modest lifestyle, while the bulk of what should have been your family's inheritance was used to build the Thornfield empire. I spent that night going through old family photographs, looking at my parents with new eyes. Had they known the full extent of what they'd participated in? Had they understood that they were trading away their children's inheritance for a monthly stipend that barely kept them above poverty? I remembered conversations from my childhood, times when my mother would receive mail that she'd quickly hide, phone calls that would make both my parents tense and whispered, arguments between them that would stop abruptly when Roderick or I entered the room. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Roderick had probably figured all of this out years ago. That's why he'd become so successful in the construction business. He'd been driven by the knowledge that his family had been cheated out of the wealth that should have been his birthright. And that's why he'd been so angry during our fight at our parents' funeral. When I'd accused him of caring more about property than family, he'd probably wanted to tell me the truth about what our family had done to us, but he hadn't been able to find the words. Or maybe he'd been protecting me from a truth he thought I couldn't handle. Mr. Greenberg called me the following Friday with news that changed everything. Mrs. Thorne, I've been in contact with Robert Thornfield's lawyers. I presented them with the evidence we've gathered regarding the fraudulent estate settlement, and their response was immediate and telling. What did they say? They want to meet. Robert Thornfield himself has requested a face-to-face meeting to discuss what he calls a family matter that has been weighing on his conscience for years. My heart started beating faster. He knows about the fraud? It appears so. Mrs. Thorne, I think we may have found someone who's willing to provide the testimony we need to prove what really happened to your grandfather's estate. We arranged to meet Robert Thornfield the following Tuesday at his office in Burlington. I spent the weekend trying to prepare myself for what would essentially be a confrontation with the family that had stolen my inheritance. Robert Thornfield was not what I had expected. Instead of the cold, calculating businessman I imagined, he was a soft-spoken man in his 60s with kind eyes and an air of genuine regret. His office was elegant but not ostentatious, and family photographs on his desk showed him with what appeared to be children and grandchildren. Mrs. Thorne, he said, standing to greet me as his secretary showed us in, I want to begin by saying how sorry I am for what my family did to yours. I've been dreading this conversation for most of my adult life, but I'm also relieved that it's finally happening. Mr. Greenberg and I sat across from Robert while he opened a file folder that appeared to contain documents spanning several decades. My father, Edward Thornfield, told me the truth about the Ashworth estate settlement when I took over the company in 1985. He said it had been eating at him for years, and he wanted someone to know the full story in case it ever came to light. He pulled out a handwritten confession, several pages long, signed by Edward Thornfield and dated March 15, 1985. My father wrote this as a kind of insurance policy. He was afraid that someday someone would figure out what they'd done, and he wanted to make sure the family understood the consequences of their actions. I read the confession with trembling hands. Edward Thornfield had detailed the entire fraud, how Margaret Ashworth had approached her brothers in 1956, claiming that her husband was planning to cut her out of his will in favor of their son, James, my father. She'd convinced them to help her create the fake debt structure that would allow the Thornfield family to claim Harold's assets while leaving Margaret in control of how the money was distributed. According to this, I said, looking up at Robert, your Aunt Margaret planned the whole thing before Grandfather Harold even died. Yes, she was apparently convinced that Harold was going to leave everything to his son and leave her with nothing. The irony is that when we found Harold's actual will years later, he'd left it all to Margaret, with the understanding that she would provide for James and eventually pass the inheritance on to his grandchildren, you and your brother. The betrayal was even worse than I'd imagined. My grandfather had trusted his wife to take care of his family, and she'd used that trust to steal from her own children. What happened to the money? Mr. Greenberg asked. Robert opened another folder. Initially, it was used to purchase real estate and expand the family business, but over the years, a portion of it was set aside in what my father called the restitution fund, money that was always intended to be returned to the Ashworth family someday.
He handed us a bank statement showing an account with a current balance of $1.7 million. This represents approximately 15% of what was taken from your grandfather's estate, plus conservative interest over the years. It's not full restitution. Too much of the original money has been integrated into business operations to extract cleanly, but it's what my family has been able to set aside. I stared at the bank statement, barely able to process what I was seeing. $1.7 million. More money than I'd ever dreamed of having.
Mrs. Thorne, Robert continued, there's something else. Your brother contacted me about 18 months ago. He'd figured out most of the story on his own and demanded a meeting. I told him about the restitution fund, and he asked me to hold on to it until after his death. Roderick knew about this money? He did. He said he wanted you to discover the truth on your own, without him influencing your decision about what to do with the information. He felt that you deserved to understand the full scope of what had been done to your family. Robert reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an envelope with my name written on it in Roderick's handwriting. He asked me to give you this if you ever came forward with questions about the family history. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and read Roderick's final letter to me. Rosalind, if you're reading this, then you found the truth about what our family did to us. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you directly, but I needed you to discover it yourself so you'd understand that I wasn't making accusations based on anger or resentment. Our parents stole our inheritance, and they let us grow up poor while other people got rich off our grandfather's hard work. I've been carrying this knowledge for 20 years, and it's eaten at me every day. I couldn't figure out how to forgive them, and I couldn't figure out how to tell you without destroying your memories of them. Maybe I was wrong to keep it secret for so long. The money Robert will show you belongs to both of us. It's what we can recover of what should have been ours all along. Use it to have the life you deserved to have. I'm sorry we wasted so many years being angry at each other instead of being angry at the people who actually betrayed us. I hope you can forgive me for keeping this from you. Your brother, Roderick. I cried then, sitting in Robert Thornfield's office, mourning not just for the brother I'd lost, but for all the years we'd wasted being estranged from each other when we should have been allies against the people who'd really wronged us. Mrs. Thorne, Robert said, I know this is overwhelming, but there's one more thing we need to discuss. My family has been living with the guilt of this theft for 3 generations. We've built our business on money that wasn't rightfully ours, and we want to make this right. He pulled out a formal document that appeared to be some kind of legal agreement. In addition to the restitution fund, Thornfield Development is prepared to offer you a settlement of an additional $3.8 million. This represents our calculation of what your grandfather's estate would be worth today if it had been properly invested over the past 65 years. $3.8 million, plus the $1.7 million in the restitution fund. I was looking at $5.5 million. Enough money to transform not just my life, but the lives of my children and grandchildren. Why? I asked. Why are you willing to give up so much money? Robert smiled sadly. Because it was never really our money to begin with, and because I have grandchildren of my own, and I want them to inherit a family business that was built honestly. Mr. Greenberg spent the next hour reviewing the settlement documents, asking questions about tax implications and payment schedules. The agreement was straightforward. In exchange for my promise to not pursue further legal action against the Thornfield family, they would transfer $5.5 million to accounts in my name within 30 days. As we left Robert's office, I felt like I was in a dream.
In the space of 3 weeks, I'd gone from being a struggling retiree living on Social Security to being a multimillionaire. But more than that, I'd finally understood the truth about my family's history and why Roderick had spent so many years being angry about things I'd never understood. "Mrs. Thorne," Robert said gently, "I have to ask, are you satisfied with this settlement? We could potentially pursue additional damages if you wanted to fight this in court." I thought about Roderick's letter, about his hope that I could use this money to have the life I deserved to have. I thought about Robert Thornfield's genuine remorse and his willingness to make restitution even when he wasn't legally required to do so. "No," I said finally. "This feels right. Roderick wanted justice, not revenge. This is justice." But as I drove home, I realized that my investigation had answered some questions while raising others. I now knew what had happened to my family's inheritance, but I still didn't fully understand how Roderick had discovered the truth or why he'd waited so long to act on it. And there was something else bothering me. If Roderick had known about the restitution fund for 18 months, why hadn't he taken his share of the money? Why had he continued living modestly while sitting on evidence that could have made him a millionaire? The answers to those questions were waiting for me back in Roderick's house, in files I hadn't yet discovered. I spent the evening after our meeting with Robert going through Roderick's house more systematically, looking for clues about what had driven him to orchestrate this complex revelation rather than simply taking the money and telling me about it directly. In his bedroom closet, behind a row of expensive suits that probably cost more than I'd made in some years, I found a metal file box secured with a small padlock. The same brass key that had opened the crate in the barn also opened this box. Inside were medical records dating back 5 years. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed in February 2019, with an initial prognosis of 6 to 18 months. Treatment records showed that Roderick had undergone chemotherapy and radiation, but by late 2023, his doctors had recommended palliative care only. My brother had been dying for almost 5 years, and he'd never told anyone. I sank onto his bed, clutching the medical files, and finally understood why he'd spent 18 months planning this elaborate posthumous revelation. He'd known he was running out of time, and he'd wanted to make sure I discovered the truth about our family in a way that would give me not just the money, but the full story of what had been done to us. But there was more in the file box. Insurance policies, financial documents, and a thick folder labeled Future Plans RT. When I opened it, I found detailed notes about his intentions for the settlement money, written in his careful handwriting. Rosalind deserves to understand that our parents betrayed us, but she also deserves to choose what to do with that knowledge. If she's willing to forgive them, that's her choice. If she's angry about the lies, that's understandable too. The money should give her options she's never had, the freedom to be generous or vindictive, to move on, or to dig deeper. I won't make those choices for her from beyond the grave. But there's something else she needs to know. Something I discovered in the final stages of my investigation. The Thornfield family wasn't the only group that profited from grandfather's stolen estate. There were others. And some of them are still very much alive and very much in denial about what they participated in. My hands were shaking as I read on. Dr. Marcus Henley was grandfather's business partner in several real estate ventures in the 1950s. When the estate was settled, Henley claimed that grandfather owed his family $200,000 for a failed land development project. Like the Thornfield debts, this claim was fraudulent. I have documentation proving that the land deal was actually profitable and that Henley's family made money from it both initially and when they resold the properties years later. The Henley family used their share of grandfather's stolen money to establish Henley Medical Group, which now operates 4 hospitals in Vermont and New Hampshire. Dr. Marcus Henley is dead, but his son, Dr. James Henley, still runs the organization and has no idea that his family's medical empire was built on fraud. Rosalind will have to decide whether to pursue this, but she deserves to know that our grandfather's money didn't just go to the Thornfields. It was divided among several families who all participated in the conspiracy to defraud the estate. I spent the next 2 hours reading through Roderick's meticulously documented research on the Henley family's involvement in the fraud. He'd traced property records, business partnerships, and financial transactions that painted a clear picture of a coordinated effort to strip assets from Harold Ashworth's estate. Dr. Marcus Henley had been Harold's partner in purchasing and developing several commercial properties in downtown Burlington during the early 1950s. The ventures had been profitable, and Harold's estate should have inherited his share of the ongoing revenue from those properties. Instead, Henley had claimed that Harold owed money on the deals and had used that false claim to take complete ownership of properties worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Those properties were now worth millions and formed the foundation of the Henley Medical Group's real estate holdings. But the most shocking discovery was a letter tucked into the back of the folder, written on official letterhead from Henley Medical Group and dated just 6 months ago. Mr. Ashworth, your recent inquiries regarding the estate settlement of Harold Ashworth in 1957 have been brought to our attention. While we appreciate your interest in historical business relationships, we must advise you that any claims against our organization related to transactions from that era are barred by statutes of limitations. However, in the interest of maintaining community goodwill, we would be willing to discuss a modest charitable contribution to a cause of your choosing. Please contact our legal department if you wish to pursue this matter. Sincerely, Dr. James Henley, CEO. Roderick had contacted the Henley Medical Group about the fraudulent estate claims, and they'd essentially tried to buy him off with an offer of charitable donations. It was an admission of guilt disguised as a generous gesture, and it told me that Dr. James Henley knew exactly what his father had done. I found Roderick's draft response to that letter, never sent but revealing his intentions. Dr. Henley, I'm not interested in charitable contributions for money that was stolen from my family. I'm interested in justice and full restitution. My grandfather's estate was defrauded of approximately $200,000 in 1957 dollars related to the Burlington commercial properties that now form part of your organization's holdings. Adjusted for inflation and reasonable investment returns, that represents a current value of approximately $3.2 million. I'll be in touch with specific documentation and demands once I've completed my investigation. This matter will not be resolved with donations or goodwill gestures. R. Ashworth.
I'm not prepared to transfer ownership of the buildings themselves. They're integral to our operations and serve the healthcare needs of the community. But I am prepared to offer fair compensation based on what your grandfather's share of those properties would be worth today. Dr. Henley pulled out a formal document that appeared to be a settlement offer. Mrs. Thorne, Henley Medical Group is prepared to offer you $4.1 million in compensation for the fraudulent claims made against your grandfather's estate. This represents 50% of the current value of the properties, which corresponds to your grandfather's original ownership stake in the partnerships. Another $4.1 million. Combined with the Thornfield settlement, I was looking at nearly $10 million in restitution. But there was something in Dr. Henley's manner that suggested he wasn't finished. There's something else, Mrs. Thorne. Something I discovered in my father's papers that I think you need to know about. He pulled out a letter written in faded ink on personal stationery. This is a letter my father wrote to your grandmother Margaret in 1958, 1 year after your grandfather's death. I found it in his personal files, apparently never sent. I read the letter with growing horror. Margaret, I've been having second thoughts about what we did to Harold's estate. The business partnerships were legitimate and profitable. We didn't need to create false debts to claim the properties. I'm concerned that James and Dorothy, my parents, are going to figure out what really happened, especially as the children get older and start asking questions about their grandfather's legacy. Perhaps we should consider setting aside funds to provide for Roderick and Rosalind's education and future needs. The current arrangement feels more like theft than business. Marcus.
Your father had second thoughts about the fraud, I said, looking up at Dr. Henley. He did. And based on other documents I found, he actually did set aside money for you and your brother. There's a trust account that's been maintained since 1959, originally funded with $50,000 and allowed to grow over the decades. Dr. Henley handed me a bank statement showing an account with a current balance of $687,000. This trust was set up to provide for the Ashworth grandchildren's education and future needs, but it was never distributed because my father died suddenly in 1964 and apparently never told anyone else about its existence. Nearly $700,000 that had been sitting in a bank account for over 60 years, earning interest and waiting for Roderick and me to claim it. Mrs. Thorne, Dr. Henley continued, "This discovery has made me realize that my family's guilt goes deeper than just the fraudulent property claims. We've been the beneficiaries of stolen money for 3 generations, and we've built our reputation and our organization on that foundation." He pulled out another document. In addition to the $4.1 million settlement for the property claims and the $687,000 in the trust account, Henley Medical Group would like to establish the Harold Ashworth Memorial Fund with an initial endowment of $2 million. This fund would provide healthcare scholarships for underprivileged students in Vermont and New Hampshire. The total package was staggering, nearly $7 million from the Henley family alone, plus the $5.5 million from the Thornfields. Almost $12.5 million in total restitution for the theft of my grandfather's estate. Why? I asked. Why are you willing to do so much when you could probably fight this in court and win based on statutes of limitations? Dr. Henley was quiet for a long moment, looking out his window at the lake. Mrs. Thorne, I've spent my entire career trying to help people, trying to build something meaningful that would serve the community. Learning that it was all built on theft, it changes how I see everything my family has accomplished. He turned back to me. I have grandchildren of my own. I want them to inherit an organization that was built honestly, even if that means acknowledging and correcting the sins of previous generations. As Mr. Greenberg reviewed the settlement documents, I found myself thinking about Roderick and his final years of research and investigation. He'd uncovered a conspiracy that went far beyond simple sibling rivalry or family property disputes. He'd discovered that multiple families had coordinated to defraud our grandfather's estate, and that the consequences of that fraud had shaped our entire lives. But he'd also discovered that some people, when confronted with the truth about their family's crimes, were willing to make things right. Mr. Greenberg said carefully, "These settlement offers are extraordinary. Combined with the Thornfield agreement, you're looking at total restitution of approximately $12.5 million. $12.5 million. More money than I could spend in several lifetimes." "There's one more thing," Dr. Henley said. "Your brother's research was remarkably thorough, but he may not have discovered everything. There's a possibility that other families were involved in the conspiracy against your grandfather's estate." He pulled out a list that appeared to be in Roderick's handwriting. "These were names your brother asked me about, other business associates of your grandfather who might have made fraudulent claims against the estate. I don't have information about most of them, but there are 2 families, the Caldwells and the Morrisons, who might warrant investigation." I stared at the list, realizing that Roderick's research might have uncovered an even larger conspiracy than what we'd already discovered. Mr. Greenberg said carefully, "You need to decide whether you want to continue investigating or whether you're satisfied with the restitution you're receiving from the Thornfield and Henley families." I thought about Roderick's note that he didn't want me to spend the rest of my life fighting legal battles. I thought about the fact that at 70, I had more money coming to me than I could reasonably use. I thought about the years of anger and estrangement that had defined my relationship with my brother, and how much I wished we could have reconciled before his death. "I think," I said finally, "that $12.5 million is enough justice for one lifetime. Roderick wanted me to know the truth, and now I do. He wanted our family's money returned to us, and it has been.
I don't need to spend whatever years I have left uncovering every detail of a conspiracy that happened before I was even born. Dr. Henley smiled with what appeared to be relief. I think that's wise, Mrs. Thorne, and I think your brother would be proud of how you've handled the situation. As we left Dr. Henley's office, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The mystery that had consumed the last month of my life was essentially solved. The money that should have been my family's inheritance was being returned to me, and the truth about why Roderick had been so angry for so many years finally made sense. But most importantly, I understood that my brother's elaborate posthumous revelation hadn't just been about money or justice. It had been about giving me the tools to write my own ending to our family story. I could choose to be bitter about the years of poverty and struggle that had resulted from my grandparents' theft, or I could choose to be grateful for the opportunity to live my final years with financial security and the knowledge that justice had been served. I could choose to honor Roderick's memory by using the restitution money wisely, or I could choose to pursue every last dollar that might have been stolen from our family decades ago. For the first time in my life, I had choices, real choices, backed by real resources. And that, I realized, was exactly what Roderick had wanted to give me. 6 months after that life-changing meeting with Dr. Henley, I was sitting in the sunroom of my new house, watching the morning light play across Lake Champlain through floor-to-ceiling windows, and marveling at how completely my world had transformed. The $12.5 million in settlement money had been transferred to my accounts, the legal paperwork was finalized, and for the first time in my 70 years, I was living without the constant weight of financial worry. But the money, as incredible as it was, turned out to be only part of the gift Roderick had left me. The real treasure was the truth about our family, the understanding of why our relationship had fractured, and the opportunity to honor his memory by using our recovered inheritance wisely. The house I'd purchased was a renovated Victorian on the shores of Lake Champlain, with enough space for my children and grandchildren to visit comfortably. It wasn't ostentatious. I'd learned from our family's history that true wealth wasn't about showing off, but about having the freedom to make choices based on what mattered most to you. I'd also learned something else from those months of investigation and revelation. I wasn't ready to simply retire and fade away. At 70, with more resources than I'd ever dreamed of having, I had the opportunity to build something meaningful with the time I had left. That's why I was sitting in my sunroom on this particular morning, reviewing architectural plans for what would become the Harold Ashworth Center for Financial Justice. Mrs. Thorne, said Margaret Chen, the project coordinator I'd hired to help develop the center, the contractors estimate that construction will take about 18 months, but we could have the first programs operational within 6 months if we use temporary facilities. The Harold Ashworth Center was my way of ensuring that what had happened to our family's inheritance couldn't happen to others. It would provide free legal assistance to elderly people and their families dealing with estate fraud, financial exploitation, and inheritance disputes. It would also offer education programs about estate planning and financial protection for vulnerable populations. 18 months sounds reasonable, I said, studying the plans for the main building. But let's definitely move forward with the temporary programs. There are probably families out there right now dealing with situations like ours. I'd located the center in Burlington, close enough to the Henley Medical Group headquarters that Dr. Henley could serve on our advisory board if he chose to. He'd been surprisingly enthusiastic about the project, seeing it as a way to honor his father's belated attempt at restitution while serving the community his medical group was committed to helping. Robert Thornfield had also expressed interest in supporting the center's work. It seemed that both families, having confronted the truth about their ancestors' crimes, were genuinely committed to making sure such fraud couldn't be easily perpetrated in the future. "There's something else we should discuss," Margaret said, pulling out another folder. "We've received over 200 inquiries since you announced the center's formation.
People who think they might have been victims of estate fraud, families dealing with financial exploitation of elderly relatives, lawyers looking for resources to help their clients. I'd expected some interest when I had announced the formation of the center in a newspaper interview about my inheritance case, but the response had been overwhelming. It seemed that estate fraud and financial exploitation were far more common problems than I'd realized.
200 cases in 6 months, I said, shaking my head. Roderick would be amazed to know how many other families have gone through something similar to ours. Actually, Mrs. Thorne, there's one case in particular that I think you should review personally. Margaret handed me a file folder. A woman named Clara Whitfield in Montpelier. Her story has some striking similarities to yours. I opened Clara's file and immediately understood why Margaret thought I should see it. Clara was 75 years old and had recently inherited a small farm from her deceased brother. Like me, she'd discovered evidence that her family had once been wealthy, but that assets had mysteriously disappeared during her grandfather's estate settlement in the 1960s. Unlike my case, Clara's family hadn't been involved in the fraud. They'd been victims of it, just as my grandfather had been. And unlike my situation, the people who'd stolen from Clara's family were still alive and still actively concealing their crimes. She's been trying to get legal help for 3 years, Margaret explained. But estate cases from the 1960s are complex, and most lawyers don't want to take on cases where the evidence is old and the legal fees might exceed any potential recovery. I studied Clara's documentation. It wasn't as complete as Roderick's research had been, but it painted a clear picture of systematic theft by business partners who'd used her grandfather's death to claim ownership of valuable farmland and equipment. Margaret, how much do you think it would cost to properly investigate Clara's case and pursue justice if the evidence supports her claims? Probably $200,000 to $300,000 in legal fees and investigation costs, and that's with no guarantee of recovery. $300,000. Before my inheritance, that would have been an unimaginable sum. Now, it represented less than 3% of what I'd recovered from my own family's stolen estate. Set up a meeting with Clara, and let's retain the best estate fraud attorneys in New England to review her case. If someone stole from her family the way they stole from ours, she deserves justice. This is what I'd realized over the past 6 months. The money wasn't just meant to make my final years comfortable. It was meant to be used to accomplish things that mattered, to prevent other families from suffering the way ours had. Later that afternoon, I drove out to the old family farm to check on the restoration progress. I'd decided to preserve the barn rather than tear it down, turning it into a conference and event center for the Harold Ashworth Center's programs. Pete Morrison, the contractor who'd helped me discover the hidden crate, was overseeing the renovation with the kind of attention to detail that the historic structure deserved. "Mrs. Thorne," Pete called out as I approached the barn, "you need to see what we found when we were reinforcing the foundation." He led me to the spot where we'd originally discovered the crate, but now there was a larger excavation revealing what appeared to be the remains of an even older foundation. This barn was built on top of a much earlier structure. Based on the stonework and construction techniques, I'd guess the original foundation dates to the 1800s, maybe earlier. I knelt down and examined the old stones, thinking about all the generations of my family who had worked this land, built their lives here, and passed their legacy down to their children. The fraud that had stolen our grandfather's wealth was just one chapter in a much longer story of hard work, determination, and family bonds that had endured despite betrayal and loss. "Pete, make sure we preserve and incorporate the original foundation into the restoration. I want people to understand that this place has a history that goes deeper than any individual tragedy or triumph." As Pete and his crew continued their work, I walked through the barn's interior, remembering that first day when I'd stepped inside and discovered the loose floorboards that had led me to the truth about my family. The building looked completely different now, structurally sound, well lit, and filled with the sounds of construction and renewal rather than decades of silence and neglect. But in the corner where the crate had been hidden, I'd asked Pete to install a small memorial plaque.
in memory of Harold Ashworth, 1881 to 1957, and Roderick Ashworth, 1946 to 2024. Their legacy lives on in the pursuit of justice and the protection of family bonds. That evening, I had dinner with my daughter Jennifer, who'd flown in from Florida to see the progress on both the house and the center. We sat on my new deck, overlooking the lake, sharing a bottle of wine that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. "Mom," Jennifer said, "I have to ask, do you ever feel guilty about having all this money? I mean, it's wonderful that you're using it for good causes, but $12.5 million is an enormous amount." I considered her question carefully. It was something I'd thought about often over the past 6 months. I feel guilty about the years Roderick and I wasted being angry at each other. I feel sad about the poverty and struggle our family endured because of other people's greed, but I don't feel guilty about the money itself. It was always supposed to be ours. We're just finally getting what should have been our inheritance all along. But what about the families who paid the settlements, the Thornfields and the Henleys? They're essentially paying for crimes their ancestors committed.
That's true, I acknowledged. But both Robert Thornfield and Dr. Henley made their decisions voluntarily. They could have fought the claims in court, and they probably would have won based on statutes of limitations. They chose to make restitution because they wanted their families' legacies to be built on honesty rather than theft. Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. It's remarkable that they were willing to give up so much money to do the right thing. It is. And it gives me hope that most people, when confronted with the truth about injustices in their family's past, will choose justice over self-interest. We talked until late that night about my plans for the center, about the impact it might have on other families dealing with similar situations, and about the legacy I hope to leave for my grandchildren. It was the kind of deep, meaningful conversation I'd rarely had before my inheritance. Not because I hadn't wanted to, but because the constant stress of financial insecurity had made it difficult to think beyond immediate needs. The next morning, I met with Clara Whitfield for the first time. She was a small, determined woman with bright eyes and a firm handshake, and I liked her immediately. "Mrs. Thorne," she said as we sat in my sunroom, "I can't thank you enough for taking an interest in my case. I was beginning to think I'd never find anyone willing to help me fight for my family's stolen land." I reviewed her documentation again, this time with the benefit of my own experience in uncovering estate fraud. Clara's grandfather had owned 300 acres of prime agricultural land in central Vermont, along with valuable timber rights and water access that made the property extremely desirable for development. When he died in 1963, his business partner claimed that the grandfather owed money for failed crop investments and equipment purchases. Those debts, like the ones claimed against my grandfather's estate, appeared to be fraudulent. But Clara's family had been too overwhelmed by grief and too trusting of the partner's claims to challenge them effectively. "Clara," I said, "based on what I'm seeing here, I think you have a strong case. The documentation is similar to what we found in my family's situation, and the pattern of fraud is almost identical." "But it's been over 60 years, Clara said. "Surely there are legal limits on how long I can wait to challenge something like this?" "There are statutes of limitations," I agreed, "but there are also exceptions when fraud has been concealed or when new evidence comes to light. And more importantly, sometimes the threat of public exposure is more powerful than the threat of legal action." I told Clara about Robert Thornfield and Dr. Henley's willingness to make restitution without being forced to do so by courts. When people understood the moral weight of profiting from theft, especially theft from grieving families, they often chose to do the right thing rather than hide behind legal technicalities. "I want to fund a complete investigation of your case," I told her. "If we can prove that your family's land was stolen through fraudulent claims, we'll approach the current owners with the evidence and see if they're willing to make restitution." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Thorne, I don't know how to repay such generosity." "You don't need to repay it. This is what the money is for, making sure that families like ours get justice, even when it takes decades to uncover the truth." Over the following months, the Harold Ashworth Center's attorneys investigated Clara's case with the same thoroughness that Mr. Greenberg had brought to my family's situation. What they discovered was even more extensive fraud than we'd initially suspected.
The business partner who'd claimed debts against Clara's grandfather's estate had not only stolen the farmland, but had also forged documents to claim ownership of mineral rights and water access that were legally separate from the agricultural property. Those rights were now worth over $3 million, having been leased to development companies for decades. When we presented our evidence to the current property owners, the business partner's grandchildren, their response was immediate and decisive. Like Robert Thornfield and Dr. Henley, they chose restitution over legal battles. Clara received a settlement of $2.1 million, enough to ensure her comfort for the rest of her life and to provide a substantial inheritance for her own children and grandchildren. But more importantly, the success of Clara's case attracted attention from other families dealing with similar situations. The Harold Ashworth Center began receiving inquiries from across New England and then from around the country as word spread about our work. By the time I celebrated my 71st birthday, the center had successfully recovered over $15 million in stolen assets for 12 different families. We'd also helped dozens of other families protect themselves from ongoing financial exploitation and had provided education programs that reached thousands of people. Mrs. Thorne, Margaret Chen said during our weekly planning meeting, "I think it's time to consider expanding beyond New England. We're getting calls from families in California, Texas, Florida, people who need help but can't travel here for assistance."
I'd been thinking about expansion myself. The problem of estate fraud and financial exploitation was clearly national in scope, and the resources I'd recovered from my own family's case were more than sufficient to fund a much larger operation. Let's start with satellite offices in major metropolitan areas, I said. Places where there are concentrations of both elderly populations and complex estate issues. And let's partner with law schools. This could be a great way to give students real-world experience in estate law while providing affordable services to families who need help. That afternoon, I visited Roderick's grave for the first time since his funeral. It was a simple granite headstone in the cemetery where our parents were buried, with just his name and dates. But I'd arranged for a small addition to be engraved. Brother, researcher, truth seeker. Roderick, I said aloud, feeling slightly foolish, but needing to speak to him somehow. I want you to know that I understand now why you were so angry for so many years. I understand why you couldn't forgive our parents, and I understand why you felt like you had to carry the truth about our family alone. I placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on his grave, flowers I'd picked from the meadow beside the restored barn where he'd hidden the evidence that changed my life. I also want you to know that the money you helped me recover isn't just sitting in bank accounts. It's working. It's helping other families find justice the way we did, and it's making sure that the next generation understands the difference between wealth that's earned honestly and wealth that's built on theft. As I stood there in the quiet cemetery, I realized that my brother's greatest gift hadn't been the inheritance money or even the truth about our family's history. His greatest gift was showing me that it's never too late to fight for justice, never too late to make things right, and never too late to choose forgiveness over bitterness. 6 months later, I received a phone call that brought my story full circle in a way I'd never expected. "Mrs. Thorne," the voice on the phone said, "my name is David Morrison. I'm calling because I believe my family may have participated in the fraud against your grandfather's estate." David Morrison turned out to be the grandson of one of the names on Roderick's research list, one of the families we'd never investigated because I'd decided that $12.5 million in restitution was enough for one lifetime. "Mrs. Morrison," he continued, "I've been researching my family's history for a genealogy project, and I found documents suggesting that my grandfather made false claims against Harold Ashworth's estate in 1957. I've been struggling with what to do about this information." I listened as David described discovering evidence of his grandfather's participation in the conspiracy to defraud my grandfather's estate. Like Dr. Henley and Robert Thornfield, he was calling not because he'd been caught, but because he couldn't live with the knowledge of his family's crimes. "Mr. Morrison," I said, "I appreciate your honesty, but I made a decision several years ago not to pursue every possible claim related to my grandfather's estate.
The Harold Ashworth Center is doing important work, and I'd rather focus on helping other families than spending my remaining years fighting old battles. Mrs. Thorne, I understand your position, but I hope you'll reconsider. Not because I think you should pursue legal action against my family, but because I'd like to contribute to the work you're doing. David went on to explain that the Morrison family's portion of the stolen assets had been used to build a successful accounting firm that now had offices in 6 states. He wanted to make a voluntary contribution to the Harold Ashworth Center, not as restitution for old crimes, but as a way of honoring the victims of financial fraud and supporting our work to prevent future exploitation. "We're prepared to contribute $1 million to your center's endowment," he said, "and we'd like to establish an annual scholarship program for students studying estate law and elder advocacy." I accepted David's contribution, not because I felt entitled to it, but because I realized that allowing people to make amends for their family's past crimes was almost as important as seeking justice for those crimes. The Harold Ashworth Center's work had grown beyond my wildest expectations. What had started as my personal quest for justice had become a national organization with offices in 12 cities, partnerships with 15 law schools, and a track record of recovering over $100 million in stolen assets for families across the country. But perhaps more importantly, the center had become a symbol of the idea that it's never too late to do the right thing, never too late to acknowledge past injustices, and never too late to choose honesty over self-interest. On my 73rd birthday, I stood once again in the restored barn where this incredible journey had begun. The building was now a beautiful event space that hosted conferences, workshops, and educational programs for hundreds of people each year. The memorial plaque for Harold and Roderick was surrounded by photographs and documents telling the story of the Ashworth family's stolen inheritance and eventual recovery. But the display that meant the most to me was a collection of letters from families we'd helped. Handwritten notes from elderly people who'd recovered stolen inheritances, from children who'd learned the truth about their family histories, from grandchildren who would now inherit wealth that had almost been lost forever. Each letter represented a family whose story had a different ending because of the work we were doing. Each letter was evidence that Roderick's final gift to me had multiplied far beyond anything he could have imagined.
As I walked through the barn that evening, I thought about the 70-year-old woman who'd first stepped through these doors, uncertain and afraid, carrying nothing but her brother's cryptic letter and a key to a hidden crate. That woman had been financially insecure, estranged from her family's history, and burdened by years of unresolved grief and resentment. The woman I'd become was financially secure, yes, but more importantly, she was purposeful. She understood her family's history, both its triumphs and its tragedies. She'd found a way to honor her brother's memory while building something meaningful for future generations. She'd learned that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money, it's truth, justice, and the opportunity to make things right. Standing in that barn as the sun sat over the mountains of Vermont, I finally understood what Roderick had really left me. Not just the wealth that should have been ours all along, but the chance to write the final chapter of our family's story in a way that honored everyone who'd been wronged and everyone who'd chosen to make amends. It was a good ending. Maybe not the ending either of us had expected when we were children playing in the same barn, dreaming of adventures we'd never take together. But it was an ending that proved that even the most fractured families could find their way back to love. Even the oldest injustices could be corrected, and even the quietest lives could leave lasting legacies. As I locked the barn and walked back to my house, I whispered a final thank you to my brother, wherever he was, for the mystery he'd left me to solve, for the truth he'd helped me uncover, for the resources he'd helped me recover, and most of all, for showing me that it's never too late to fight for what's right. The inheritance he'd really left me wasn't hidden under floorboards in an old barn. It was the knowledge that every ending can be a new beginning, and that the most important gift we can give each other is the chance to make things right.
Now you know the full story of how I inherited a crumbling barn from my brother and discovered a truth that changed everything. I hope my journey inspires you to never give up on justice, never stop fighting for your family, and never forget that sometimes the most valuable treasures are the ones that take a lifetime to find. Thank you for following this incredible journey with me. I'm curious, what would you have done in my situation? Would you have pursued every possible claim, or would you have been satisfied with partial justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled around the world.